for boys and men. Richard, thank you so much for joining us across this entire series.
Thank you, Magna. It's been a pleasure to be part of this.
Thank you for joining us for this special series, Falling Behind, the Miseducation of America's Boys. If you missed an earlier episode or know someone that might be interested in the series, you can find all 5 parts in the On Point podcast feed, wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Meghna Chakrabarty. This is On Point.
On Point is a production of WBUR Boston and is distributed by APM, American Public Media.
Support for On Point comes from the Mehrotra Institute for Business, Markets, and Society, hosting the Is Business Broken podcast, featuring conversations with academics, industry leaders, and politicians. More at ibms.bu.edu. And BetterHelp, committed to supporting mental health through therapy and helping clients find balance. Clients are matched with one of 30,000 therapists for online therapy from anywhere at betterhelp.com/public.
It's sunny and 62 degrees outside the studios of KUOW FM Seattle, KUOW Tumwater, and KQOW Bellingham. It's almost noon, almost time for Weekend Review. Filling in for Bill Ratke, here's Mike Lewis to give us a preview of today's show.
So why did FEMA say no to Washington State's request for disaster relief following last year's destructive bomb cyclone? Why are ecologists, chemists, and biologists taking turns cleaning toilets? What other federal cuts are having an impact on our state? We'll discuss all of that and find something to smile about on Weekend Review coming right up.
A new podcast uses folk tales to explore the richness of Sudan's culture and history at a time when the country is mired in a devastating civil war. When you hear the music, read the literature, taste the food of a people, you come closer to them. I'm Elsa Chang, Folk Tales from Sudan on All Things Considered from NPR News.
All Things Considered coming up this afternoon at 3 with Kim Malcolm on 94.9 KUOW.
Hey there, I'm Katie Campbell, and I run the KUOW Book Club. KUOW is partnering with the Seattle Public Library for Seattle Reads. That means we'll be reading You Are Here, Poetry in the Natural World by U.S. Poet Laureate Ada Limon. The collection features 2 poets from the Seattle area, and we'll hear from them later this month about what inspired their contributions. Learn more and subscribe to the Book Club newsletter at kuow.org/books.
Support for KUOW comes from the Holocaust Center for Humanity, commemorating Holocaust Remembrance Day on April 27th. 80 years later, stories of survival and liberation. Local survivors reflect on their Holocaust experiences and afterwards. Info at holocaustcenterseattle.org.
On the next Throughline from NPR.
There's a very widespread assumption that
humans deep down are fundamentally selfish. Or maybe even worse than that. Maybe we're even beasts or monsters.
And the science, the evidence, the sociology doesn't really support that.
What the heart of human nature means for our society's future.
It's on Throughline tomorrow at 3 on 94.9 KUOW. It's 12:01.
Live from NPR News in Washington, I'm Janine Herbst. Senator Chris Van Hollen held a face-to-face meeting with Kilmar Abrego Garcia. He's the man illegally deported to a mega prison in El Salvador by the Trump administration. NPR's Ryland Barton reports the Maryland Democratic senator was initially turned away by Salvadorian officials.
In an interview yesterday on All Things Considered, Van Hollen said soldiers had initially prevented him from reaching the prison.
They simply said they had been given orders not to allow me to visit him.
Later in the day, the president of El Salvador, Nayib Bukele, posted on X that Van Hollen had met with Abrego Garcia and said that he, quote, gets the honor of staying in El Salvador's custody. The senator then posted a picture of himself and Abrego Garcia sitting at a table. Also yesterday, a federal appeals court declined the Trump administration's request to lift a judge's order that they help bring Abrego Garcia back to the U.S. Ryland Barton, NPR News.
The Trump administration has redirected government websites about COVID-19 to a White House page dedicated to a controversial theory that the pandemic was caused by the virus leaking from a Chinese government lab. NPR's Rob Stein has more.
The original federal websites had provided the public with basic information about COVID-19, such as vaccines, treatment, and testing. But those sites are gone and now direct visitors to the White House website and a page titled Lab Leak, The True Origins of COVID-19. That theory argues the virus escaped from a Chinese government lab in Wuhan, China, and then spread around the world. Most scientists believe that the virus most likely originated naturally in a wild animal and then spread to people in a market located in Wuhan. Rob Stein, NPR News.
Ukrainian President Zelensky says there's evidence that China is supplying Russia with artillery and gunpowder. NPR's Joanna Kakissis reports Zelensky didn't elaborate on this evidence, while China says the charge is baseless.
Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesperson Lin Jian said Beijing has not sent weapons or ammunition to either Russia or Ukraine during the war that China calls a crisis. Speaking to reporters in Kyiv on Thursday, Zelensky said Ukraine's intelligence has documented such shipments from China to Russia and said he wasn't surprised. Zelensky said Chinese leader Xi Jinping promised earlier in the war that he would not sell or send weapons to Russia. Unfortunately, now we see information to the contrary. Zelensky said he would provide more information about these shipments sometime next week. Ukraine has also captured 2 Chinese nationals fighting for Russia. Joanna Kakissis, NPR News, Kyiv.
Wall Street is closed today in observance of Good Friday. You're listening to NPR News.
This is KUOW News. I'm Kevin Kniestead in Seattle. AmeriCorps, a federal agency focused on national service and volunteerism, has become the latest group to be targeted by President Trump in an effort to shrink the government. KUOW's Noel Gasca has more.
According to reporting from The Hill, the Trump administration placed most AmeriCorps staffers on paid administrative leave on Wednesday. The state branch of AmeriCorps, Serve Washington, was established in 1994 with the mission to make service a part of the lives of all Washingtonians. According to Serve Washington, in 2023, more than 5,000 volunteers served at schools, food banks, youth centers, and other nonprofits in 32 counties across the state. In King County alone, AmeriCorps volunteers serve under programs like Girl Scouts of Western Washington, Teach for America, and Jumpstart. Interview requests to Serve Washington were not answered, but a spokesperson from City Year, a program that partners with AmeriCorps, said in an emailed statement that City Year AmeriCorps members are continuing their work in schools across the country while monitoring recent events. Noel Gasca, KUOW News.
People visiting Alki Beach this summer will notice more police officers and park rangers patrolling the area. The Alki Community Council just released its summer safety plan, and it says officers will spend more time in known crime hotspots and will keep an eye on areas where street racing has been a problem. The Seattle Parks Department has closed Alki Beach early over the past 3 summers because of increased violence and illegal activities at the beachfront park. And this year, the department decided to make those seasonal changes permanent. So starting May 23rd through the summer, Alki Beach will be open from 4 a.m. to 10:30 p.m. Sunny skies today, highs near 71 degrees. Increasing clouds overnight with a slight chance of showers, lows around 48. This is KUOW.
Support for NPR comes from NPR stations. Other contributors include Subaru. In partnership with the Arbor Day Foundation, Subaru is distributing over 100,000 trees this year to grow greener, healthier communities for generations to come. Subaru, more than a car company.
Welcome to Friday and welcome to Week in Review. Joining us today are political analyst, contributing columnist, and recurring cast member Joni Balter. Welcome,
Hi there.
Joni.
That's a new title. I like that. Thank you.
PubliCola co-founder and publisher, and the most important one-third of Seattle Nice podcast, Erica Barnett.
Hi, Mike.
Yeah, you do it, Erica. Seattle Times editorial writer Josh Farley. And Josh, because we'd not worked together on the show before, I asked your fellow editorial board member Claudia Rowe about you, and she said Josh is great and he's really smart. And all I have to say to that is, we'll see.
Okay, the pressure's on.
He did a lot of prep even for the opening. Look at that.
I'm Mike Lewis, the counterfeit Bill Radke. On with the show. From the Seattle Times, this is from the Seattle Times. The Trump administration denied the state's request for disaster relief following the bomb cyclone last November that killed 2 people and caused $34 million in damage. According to Governor Bob Ferguson, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, also known as FEMA, offered no explanation for the denial except that the assistance was, quote, not warranted. The request for aid was issued by former Governor Jay Inslee in January. President Donald Trump, who has talked of eliminating FEMA, has shown only, roughly 2 branches in his decision tree, transactional and retaliatory. Joni, how should Washington lawmakers prepare for not just this, but the next 4 years?
Hold on to your hat, your seat belt, whatever you got. This is clearly another example of the Trump cruelty tour, as the governor said, and you quoted it. He didn't really give, the administration didn't really give a good reason, just plain, no, we're not going to give you that money. And, we all remember the days in the before times when disasters weren't political. There weren't red or blue bomb cyclones, red or blue windstorms, tornadoes, the whole bit, forest fires for that matter. So we are in some very strange territory here. It is very possible to answer your specific question. I can imagine us needing, correct me if I'm wrong, another session of the legislature, not just for how far apart and how much work there is to do on the budget, but how do we plan for these disasters that are coming our way, and we have no assurance. So it's all about the chaos and the lack of trust at this point, perhaps. I mean, our state has been a tad litigious toward the Trump administration in earlier times and now. So we really have to have an emergency preparedness plan with some money in it. Now, I did hear from Governor Bob Ferguson at a recent Seattle University event that we're in better shape than I had thought on forest fires.
Josh, what do you think?
Well, I think we know this because in the first Trump administration, they withheld, I think, $37 million in disaster aid that was requested by the previous governor, Governor Inslee, for wildfires in eastern Washington. In Malden, I think, was the community hardest hit. And so there is a track record here. And the legislature, and I think Governor Bob Ferguson has taken a measured approach. He has consistently, throughout his very limited time as our governor of Washington State, banging this drum of we've got to be ready. So to me, I think the governor's looking at this and going, yeah, we're probably going to need to fill, even temporarily, perhaps actions that the Trump administration takes that may be ultimately ruled illegal or a judge strikes them down. We're still going to need some kind of budget to fill in the gaps. If and when we see this, we've already seen cuts to public health in Washington, Head Start,
right.
And the list goes on. And this isn't slowing. I completely agree with Joni. We are in the crosshairs. No reason given on this latest FEMA denial. It's probably going to get worse before it gets better.
All right, Erica. We're going to get into some more specifics later on in the show, but your sense of this, given that you're focused a lot on what's happening at the city level, which is also going to be getting the same treatment as any state agency, what should the city do?
Well, I mean, I think the city should be, and we'll get into this later too, I'm sure, on homelessness and some other issues, but I think the city should be running around with its hair on fire. Josh, you were talking about preparedness. I mean, the Trump administration has already completely eliminated the agency. It's called BRIC. Don't ask me what that stands for. Building Resilience and Community, something like that. That provides disaster preparedness funds, and so we're not going to have mitigation funds anymore for things like emergency resilience hubs that are being put in all over the city, for things like earthquake preparedness. All of that federal money is gone. And I don't know, and I don't get a sense of urgency from the city that they are aware of this or panicking about it yet, but they should be. Because it's not just what do we do after a disaster, it's what do we do to prevent the impacts of the disaster, and mitigate against like the worst impacts, not just of disasters, but climate change. I mean, FEMA is now denying that climate change exists in all its official documents. So, beyond just, when a disaster happens, it's how do we prevent and mitigate disasters without any of that federal funding coming through anymore?
And I'll just add that it's my sense that the city's ready for many emergency situations, but maybe not as ready as we hope for earthquakes.
Well, all right. So let's move it over to, because we've got a list of money that is not going to be coming to this area. Trash is piling up at the Northwest Fisheries Science Center and the Montlake Laboratory, and federal scientists who monitor the health of the West Coast fisheries are instead cleaning off its bathrooms and reconsidering critical experiments after the Federal Department of Commerce declined to renew their lab's contracts for hazardous waste disposal, janitorial services, IT work, and building maintenance. The Fisheries Science Center is part of the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, also known as NOAA, another agency targeted for cuts by the Trump administrations. Ecologists, chemists, biologists at the center's headquarters in Seattle are taking turns hauling garbage and discussing whether they should create a sign-up sheet to scrub toilets. A suggestion to NOAA, discussion over, clean the toilets. Joni, let's again start with you. What should NOAA do here?
Well, first of all, this is another example of how upside down our world is. If you have the scientists who were doing good work, presumably, they are now trying to prevent the waste that they're worried about from being a problem. And so, in a sense, they're proving one thing: they are valuable employees who take responsibility for their work, but also that if you take a chainsaw to government cuts and you're proud of it. I sort of liked the fact that Elon Musk stood up with the chainsaw, because it would be so memorable and so easy to predict what would follow next. Here you have scientists doing a job that they're being paid, they're paid their salaries, but they're, doing work that could be done more cheaply. So it doesn't make sense. I never wanted to live in a dumb country. I didn't.
Right. Erica, you live in the same country as Joni.
I'm so sorry. That was a bad setup.
I do.
Generally speaking. How does this play out for NOAA?
Well, I mean, I think it feels like administrative bullying, but it also feels like just general incompetence from the federal administration. I mean, the reason I understand this is happening, just from other people's reporting, is that it's that the administrator of the entire agency has to personally approve any contract over $10,000, which is a tiny contract. Our standards at the city of Seattle are significantly higher than that, and so it's just mind-boggling inefficiency. That is either intentionally cruel and intended to drive people out of these jobs, or it's just incompetence. It's not knowing how anything works and slashing and burning. What should NOAA do about it? I mean, again, I think everybody should be running around with their hair on fire. But I don't know that.
But that would interact with the chemicals they're removing in the bathroom. So maybe they should put the fire out first.
But I honestly don't know. I mean, all of these cuts, I think the answer is that we're in uncharted territory. It's really hard to say, this individual agency should, get volunteers to come and clean their bathrooms, or this other individual agency should get money from the state for, disaster mitigation, for wildfires, but not for earthquakes, or earthquakes, but not for wildfires. I mean, we're just in such unprecedented territory that it's very hard to answer for any one, agency, because they're all facing situations like this.
Josh, you raised a point about the fact that Senator Cantwell, Maria Cantwell, is raising hell about these sort of cuts and the effect on her state.
Right.
Do these voices matter at this point?
I do think they do matter. I think you have to speak up. In fact, I asked her a question on the pier at Terminal 46 on Wednesday. She was there to talk about the tariffs and the economic harm they're already having on Seattle businesses, on Washington businesses in what is a very trade-dependent state. I think they have to keep raising their voice. We have seen some successes. We are still, I think, in the flood the zone part of the second Trump administration term.
Quick question on that, though. Do we know that there's not a flood the zone phase?
Well, I think we've certainly seen the courts respond, and I'll give you one exhibit at least, which is another area. I think Erica put it well about the idea of these cuts being nonsensical. So were the Bonneville Power Administration cuts that we saw, which it took sitting members of Congress, including Dan Newhouse, to stand up and say, hey, wait a minute, Bonneville Power Administration gets its money from ratepayers that are supporting it. This is not a taxpayer-funded thing, and you're talking about cutting taxes. What is and cutting government spending? What's going on? And we saw a response on that. So yes, I think there is pushback, and of course in a year and a half, well, more than a year and a half, but we will also have elections again. And they must, our congressional delegation here in Washington State must continue to advocate as much as possible for what the actions of the Trump administration, what they're doing across the board from NOAA to BPA to these very harmful tariffs and what they're doing to Washington's economy.
Well, and also to homeless programs. So, Erica, you're now on the hot seat. You've been writing about this. What is going to be affected? And I guess we don't know what the outcome is going to be, but let's start at the short term. What's going to be affected by federal cuts from homeless services in Seattle?
So our homeless system, is essentially a bunch of different grants to nonprofits that then run all of the programs. So the city of Seattle doesn't actually run most of it. So when we're talking about federal cuts, it's federal cuts directly to those programs. So DESC, the Downtown Emergency Service Center, which provides a lot of shelter and housing for people who are the hardest to house,
right,
as well as health care. It's going to see a cut of about 25% if it doesn't, receive some kind of funding from the city, state, county, because that all comes from federal grants. So, we're looking at potentially just devastating cuts to all kinds of programs that the city, relies on to keep the homelessness at the level it is at right now, which is not good. And so, so we're looking at, potentially really, the city is going to have to make some decisions, the state's going to have to make some decisions, and the county's going to have to make some decisions because, money also flows through all those governments to other services. So, it's hard to say what the impact will be, but I think devastating would not be an exaggeration.
Let me follow up on that then. So the nonprofits that do a lot of these services, are they wholly funded in some cases by the federal government, or is it usually just a portion of what their budgets are?
It's a portion. They refer to it as braided funding. So a lot of times, like say you want to build a housing project, you have to get funding from all different sources, from private sources, from the federal government. But the problem is, it's not as though if one source providing 25% of a housing project goes away, you can still just build the housing. It makes the whole project collapse. You can't do it. So you can't finance it. You can't build it. So, it's more than, projects that rely on federal funding. It's more than just, that funding's going away and we have to replace it. It's often really complex and it can put projects back. And, I think big picture, the region is going to have to decide whether it wants to focus on triage, that is like shelters, basic health care, things that keep more people from ending up literally living on the streets, or housing, which actually solves the problem of homelessness, but takes longer to come online and can be more expensive.
Well, let's switch it over to Josh for just a moment. Before the cuts, the upcoming cuts to homeless programs, I don't think it was widely hailed that Seattle was doing a great job with the homeless situation in town. Prior to the cuts, it was difficult. When you see this, what if you were working, if the Seattle City Council asked you, what should we do? What are the options here, or are there any?
I kind of would echo Erica's point about the idea of, I think that triage has to come into play here. If we do see affordable housing projects that lose their funding, if there's still money available, you got to get a roof over somebody's head. You have to provide something, if that means emergency shelters, right. what have you. I think that's where we have to go.
Joni?
Well, you asked a good question in some of our earlier discussions about the show. Like, is this a good time for the city to take a look at its relationship with the King County Regional Homelessness Authority? I think it's not a bad time, because what you have to do is you have to measure output. How are things going so far with this agency? Maybe, and you mentioned this yourself there, Erica, maybe the city should administer some of these grants and not pay that extra amount to the homelessness authority. Maybe there's a more efficient way to do this. And with the city facing, I don't want to jump the program ahead here, but with the city facing some of its own budget worries, I wonder if this, and it's a chaotic time, so it's easy to, pile work up on people's desks, which it feels like a little bit, but I think it's a good question to ask. And not be afraid of the answer.
Well, I think we're going to go ahead.
Just real quickly, I don't think that the city was particularly efficient at administering those programs when it had them, and so.
But we're talking about degrees of inefficiency here.
Sure, but I don't know that the problem with the King County Regional Homelessness Authority is that it has too much money going to administration. It's like 8%. It's pretty low. I think the problem is, there are multifold problems.
Results is one problem.
Yeah. Well, you're talking about, sure, but you're talking about a system that is essentially just shuffled over to a different government entity that is mostly now funded by the county. And so the inefficiency or the problems with the results would be within the individual programs. And so, it's the KCRHA, should it exist, should it not exist? I was not a fan of forming it in the first place, but I don't think moving all that stuff back to the city is going to cost less. And I think that the city's focus has been on, actually in the last few budget cycles, beefing up funding for homeless encampment sweeps. And they put a lot more money into that, tens of millions of dollars. And so, adding people every single year. So maybe that's a place that we could look for cuts.
All right, everyone, just hold those thoughts for a minute, because we're going to have much more good news for you right after the break. Back with Week in Review.
Support for KUOW comes from Cambium Landscape. Since 1998, working with clients' tastes and home architecture to create landscapes that complement their lifestyles. Providing landscape design, construction, and maintenance. Designing now for spring installations. Portfolio and more at cambiumlandscape.com.
Hey, I'm Ton Vin, host of Seattle Eats, a food podcast from the Seattle Times and KUOW. A hot sandwich is a classic meal. Think paninis or tuna melts, but making a great hot sandwich is an art. On the latest episode of Seattle Eats, Seattle Times journalist Bethany Jean Clement explains what makes a perfect hot sandwich and highlights 3 local spots that hit the mark. Listen to Seattle Eats on the KUOW app or wherever you get your podcasts.
Welcome back to Week in Review. We have with us Seattle Times editorial writer Josh Farley, political analyst and contributing columnist Joni Balter, PubliCola co-founder, publisher, and 1/3 of the Seattle Nice podcast, Erica Barnett. Thank you all for joining us. All right, so this now, in an effort to maybe offset some of the cuts that the state expects to see, its own budget being a problem, but the lack of federal money being a secondary problem, Microsoft and other businesses are responding. The state is considering a proposed wealth tax. Microsoft and other major businesses are responding with a furious multi-million-dollar campaign to kill the tax. They argue it will lead to companies relocating, or it will slow job growth in Washington. To that end, Microsoft dispatched its longtime lobbyist, D. Lee Shoemaker, to the Washington Roundtable, the state's association of top business executives. And it's not just Microsoft in opposition. Costco, Nordstrom, T-Mobile, among others, are involved in the effort through a political action committee, People for an Affordable Washington. They've spent about almost $2 million over 2 months on ads and polling. Microsoft has indicated it will throw its weight behind an anti-tax ballot initiative if efforts fail in the legislature. Joni, you know a bit about this one. Is this wealth tax dead on arrival, or is this
Well,
something that actually could happen?
It's pretty dead, except for perhaps something like $100 million of funding as take it to the courts and figure it out so we don't have to talk about it again unless it would work. As I mentioned, I had Governor Ferguson on the Seattle U Conversations program a couple of weeks ago, and it was really clear. He did it really succinctly. This tax, we don't know if it'll pass legal muster, so I don't want to sign a budget, he says, that is based on stuff that'll collapse, like quicksand right away. And so he told the legislators, I'm not going to sign that because it's not a intact budget in that sense. So I think that the wealth tax is to the side. There are other taxes. It's like a grand menu of possible taxes, and they will work on those. I thought it was fascinating, that story about how the phone calls, the words used to tell Bob Ferguson long ago, Microsoft has a lot of sway in this community. It wasn't always the good company. They used to make a lot of people angry here, but they sort of have the white hat these days, just in the way they treat their employees, in the way that they do support housing and other kinds of benefits for the community.
Yeah, I would echo the bit about Microsoft. I'm thinking back, it was only 5-6 years ago now that Microsoft and some other business interests in the state supported a B&O tax increase to expand what is now the most generous financial aid package for students in Washington, in the entire country. And it feels like a very different climate now. It feels much more like there's an antagonistic relationship in terms of the different interests in Olympia. It's not that way anymore.
Erica?
I mean, I think that what struck me most about this debate over taxes is that Bob Ferguson has not proposed any alternatives. I mean, every single story I've read on this, notes that Lori Jenkins in the legislature has said, he hasn't said what he likes. And so he's opposing.
Sort of the restaurant without menus idea. Just keep bringing me stuff and I will eventually maybe approve it.
But like this cornucopia of potential taxes that has come forward, this $12 billion, he said, keep trying. And I mean, we're getting close to the end of the legislature, which could, of course, go into a special session. And he hasn't said what he wants. And to me, it's, just real quick, I think it's kind of a product of him, not being entirely comfortable in the role of governor. As Attorney General, he was like a unitary executive who could just kind of do things by fiat as long as he had money to do them. And now he's got to work with, these annoying legislators who are throwing ideas at him that he doesn't like. And eventually, he probably is going to have to say yes to something.
I think he said that he would say yes to something, but he doesn't. He's such a chess player, perhaps, that he's not going to say, I'm signing on to this tax or that tax. He already told you he's not doing a wealth tax. But what he did say in front of this audience is that he's in constant meetings to figure it out. So it's going to be done behind the scenes, and then maybe you'll hear him say exactly which one. And also as time goes on, toward the deadline for the end of the session at the end of the month, I think that's when you'll hear more about which tax he'll agree to if you do whatever cut he seems to think will occur.
Well, speaking of Governor Ferguson, we have another thing that's going to also involve potential, controversy, as you've said, Erica, his reticence sometimes about fully engaging. Rent control is again an issue in Washington in the form of House Bill 1217. This would prevent landlords from raising rent on existing tenants by more than 7% per year. Landlords could reset rent at any level once a tenant moves out, and apartments that are less than 12 years old would be exempt from the cap. The measure was amended on the Senate floor last week to allow, this is from Axios, to allow the annual rent increases of up to 10% plus the rate of inflation. That 3% difference means only one thing, a fight. Erica, walk us through this.
Well, I mean, first I want to say a 10% increase plus inflation is a big rent increase. And so I think there is a question of whether either of these bills. I mean, even 7% plus inflation represents rent stabilization in the sense that people think of stability. Even a 7% plus inflation, like say it's 3% inflation, that's still a 10% rent increase. And so, so the debate is over. Basically, should we have these new, the new higher cap? Or should we stick at 7%? Or should we have any kind of rent caps at all? Should landlords just be allowed to increase rent as much as they want every single year? I did some quick math on what it would mean to have a 10% plus inflation. And without getting into it, just a reasonable rate of inflation, you start at $2,000 a month. Within 5 years, your rent is almost $3,700. And so I think,
if they go graduated increase every single year.
If they do every single year, 10% plus the 3%. So, I mean, even if there's no inflation, your rent's going up a lot faster than, people's mortgages go up, for example. And, in Seattle, where we live, I mean, it's 60% of people are renters now. So I think it's almost a meaningless bill at that point for people who actually rent, in terms of just how much your rent can increase every year and how much instability it introduces.
Josh?
I would just add to that I think this year, if that policy does pass, it is a big year for housing still. I know that 2 years ago was the year of housing for the legislature. I think this year we've seen out of both chambers now, transit-oriented development has cleared that hurdle. We have seen the legislature is going to restrict the ability of localities to be able to mandate parking spaces in projects that they do. And all this is geared and designed to help with the supply issue, which I'll be the guy here. It's somewhere in the neighborhood of 1 million units that we need in the next 20 years. We clearly have a shortage of housing. And one of my biggest I would say pet peeves is when you see light rail or bus rapid transit that has a stop somewhere and there's not density around that. We should absolutely be building further density around this. I did query,
and we will be getting into that
okay.
in just
okay.
a minute.
I'm jumping the gun. Sorry.
Oh, no worries.
Anyway,
so Joni, let me ask you. You had mentioned in our pre-show discussion that you're not necessarily an opponent of rent caps. Explain.
I just think this is a closer call than you think, because clearly, if you talk to renters, their salaries aren't going up 7% or 10%. And we have a goal, I believe, a shared goal of keeping people in their homes and their communities. That said, you have to be really skeptical. Is this part of a comprehensive plan? Do we know exactly which side of the equation we're trying to affect? And also, you have to be careful about doing anything, taking any step that limits production of housing. As you said, Josh, what the number of new units that we need is a little mind-boggling sometimes. So, it's a closer call. I'd want to know more about how a statewide approval of this would impact cities, and suburbs for that matter, other places which already have rules in place that may help renters or hurt them.
Well, I mean, I think that I just want to point out, I mean, new housing is exempt, I believe, for 12 years,
right,
something like
correct.
that. And so I don't think rent caps, if they're, not like a strict cap, like you can't raise the rent ever over inflation. I could see how that could hurt, housing production, things like that.
Think about folks who are doing remodeling, they're upgrading stock. And that does cost real money, and it will cost ever more thanks to the tariffs for building costs and labor costs and all of that. So I just think we have to really, I just hope that the folks working on this understand they have to really take the whole problem together at the same time and make sure that what they do doesn't hurt renters or, for that matter, developers as they in smaller communities with already pre-existing rules.
Right. So since we're speaking about housing, let's just roll straight into an area that I know Josh knows a lot about. The Washington legislature is considering a bill to rewrite the current standards regarding, quote, transit-oriented development. This means, in essence, if I'm correct, potential rezoning, read that mostly as upzoning, in all city areas designed as transit hubs. Josh, can you walk us through, explain this a little bit to us first, and then what would be the effect of making these changes compared to the way things are now? Because, I mean, if you were a person living in Shoreline, you've already seen this sort of transit-oriented development to some degree.
That's right.
What's happening
That's
here?
right. Well, so obviously in the Seattle area, it's not going to be as effectual as it will be in other big counties in Washington state. But the clear idea here is that you're upzoning around transit. You're giving people the chance to live, if they can, without a car, or at least making the journey to work in a convenient way. You're building that up and out. You're increasing heights. You are also creating there's incentives within this bill for affordability. If developers put more on the side of affordability to maintain what is reasonable. I recognize this is the Puget Sound region, so reasonable is a relative term, of course. But the
spoken like an editorial writer. What can I say?
But yeah, of course. So it's going to create a lot more density. I look to our neighbors to the north in Vancouver. If you take the SkyTrain in the Vancouver, the metropolitan area, you see literally little cities. You see skyscrapers around where the SkyTrain is. It's an efficient way to move people. It's great. It obviously meets our climate goals. It reduces emissions, and there's a lot to like here. And the legislature, it looks right now like they've finally cleared this hurdle. And I talked, our lieutenant governor and former Congressman Denny Heck has done a lot of work in this area. Submitted a lot to Governor Ferguson in terms of policies and things. And I think, I don't want to put words in his mouth, but I think transit-oriented development was kind of at the top of his list in terms of things that we could do that would affect how our housing stock. We could talk more about this, but I think ultimately, though, the goal has got to be we must add housing. It's an imperative, and it's, to me, still the if not the biggest, one of the biggest stories facing the Puget Sound region.
And we've covered this bill in PubliCola. I think that, the genius thing about this bill, if I'm not mistaken, it's not an incentive program, it's a mandate for affordable housing. So in the past, that has failed. In the past, this TOD bill without a mandate has failed from different sides of the, should we do market rate supply or should we mandate affordable housing? So that's a debate among Democrats. And Republicans to some extent. But what's genius about this bill is it couples that affordable housing mandate. I think it's like 10% at 60% of AMI or 20% at 80%, and there's different lengths of time.
And explain AMI?
Sorry, area median income. So
Okay.
so 60% of area median income would be a lower income person than 80%, which is more like market rate housing.
Right.
But it combines that mandate with a tax break. So essentially, the developer or property owner gets a tax break in exchange for providing this affordable housing for a certain number of years. So it kind of makes everybody happy. And I think actually will not only allow more housing to get built, but affordable housing. In Seattle, I think it goes into place in 2029. So it's going to be quite a long time before we start seeing the benefits here.
Is there anything to follow up with you then, Erica, is there anything in Seattle, Josh made this point earlier, that is not already zoned effectively for those transit hubs? I mean, what would actually change in Seattle?
Well, I mean, I think that it's not just the places that you might think about right next to transit stations. It's 800 feet from, I believe, bus rapid transit stops. And so that would be new. I mean,
Exactly,
it might
right.
overlap in some ways with the comprehensive plan, zoning changes that are coming up, but I think it would add density. It would also have that affordable housing mandate that doesn't exist now. And so there are things that could change in Seattle. And also, in Seattle, it is very frustrating, as Josh said, to go by places where there are, major bus stops, major light rail stops, or to be on light rail and zoom past areas of density where we don't have light rail stations, but that's another
Right.
story.
Yeah.
And it's in my contract, not really, it's in my contract, but it's in my contract to bring up ferries because I'm a ferry
That's
regulatory.
true.
Oh, right, fair
I have
So,
seen it in your contract.
So ferries oriented development, I think there's an extension. I would make that argument personally that you would use this on all transit, but I'm glad Erica brought up bus rapid transit.
And you commute on the ferry, correct?
I do.
Yeah, there you go.
So we could all go look at the transit-oriented development in Canada if we thought we could
Get there.
Get there and get back into the country. But so in Seattle, I live in the South End, and it's good to see. There's quite a lot if you look at like the Rainier Avenue corridor, MLK corridor. There really is a lot of it, and it makes a ton of sense. So Seattle's been doing good work on this for a long time.
Okay, switching topics just a bit here. Seattle Representative Liz Berry has championed reforming the state's recycling system to both cut down on waste and to drive rates of recycling higher. The passage of a bill would both cut down on waste and drive the recycling to, I think, expand recycling programs, essentially. Josh, can you tell us a bit about this?
Oh, how much time do you have, Mike?
5 minutes and 20 seconds.
This is very complicated, but I will try to hit the high points here. This is a fundamental change in how we handle recycling, waste, packaging in the state of Washington. Yes, Representative Berry has been the champion around this for several years, although it was the Senate vehicle, actually, from Senator Liz Loveland, that it has passed both chambers. Nothing is ever certain in Olympia, so we'll see the rest of the way. The governor has to sign it. There's still some work to be done. But the bottom line is, to me, this bill does, it's three big things. Number one, it creates an environment first of all, we've been at like 49% for recycling rates for a long time, for decades.
And when you say 49% for recycling rates, what does that mean?
It means that of all the things that we put out to the bins that's actually recycled and the waste stream, we're about 50-50. Now, this obviously is a big broad brush I'm painting when it comes to things like aluminum cans. Our recycling market is basically a commodities market. Aluminum cans, paper, these things have pretty great value to them. So right now, even our haulers, our folks that are doing this recycling, there's money to be made in it. But plastics, by contrast, we're talking 10%, maybe less, for what is actually recycled. Joni, I think you made the point about this too. There seems to be no way our world is just overwhelmed in plastic to the point where scientists have studied this. They found it inside of dolphin breath, of all things. They found it inside our brains.
That's the plastic talking everywhere. Right now. It's actually.
That's kind of where we're at. And so this overhaul would create a state list that it would, everybody in the state, which is now a very patchwork system. Some people don't have recycling. Some people have very comprehensive recycling. It would create a state list. Everyone in Washington would know, okay, this is what can be recycled. Number two, on the front end, it would require producers. It would incentivize producers to bring more circular packaging. That is packaging like paper, like aluminum, that can be recycled many times over. And it would encourage that. It would discourage, by way of fees, some of the things that cannot be recycled. And it would use that money to basically create in Washington a more holistic recycling system, make sure more people have access to recycling, and make sure more things that we put into our waste stream and into our recycling streams can be recycled.
Quick question, Josh. When you say fees attached to these things that cannot easily be recycled, is that essentially a plastics version of a carbon credit? You can pay the fee and still make this thing?
A little bit.
But something like that?
It is something like that. It's called EPR, so it's extended producer responsibility. We actually already have this for certain products in Washington State, batteries, I believe, soon, light bulbs. We have this already on products. It basically puts the producers in the driver's seat to say, okay, you're bringing things in to our market, and we want to make sure that ultimately it can either be recycled or that we're paying the costs that we have to society. So I think that's an apt analogy.
Okay, Joni?
So I think we should be all in. I am in the uniformity. Part of the problem with recycling is which box, which thing goes where, and so you end up with a lot of waste. So it would be good to have a sort of a statewide sense of that. And I'm not just saying this because it's almost Earth Day, which I think is tomorrow or the day after. But I really do think that it's part of the culture of this state, if you think about it. To be a leader, 50% sounded okay, but you also mentioned, it was also mentioned in the stories that British Columbia goes up to 80. Well, why aren't we there? That's something I really do think that we all have an interest in. As we know, plastic isn't very good to be in your brain or in your body. So there's double, triple reasons to do that.
And British Columbia has this already, EPR, or extended producer responsibility. They have.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, if we put all the responsibility on the consumer level, it's kind of not going to matter. I mean, unless things become more expensive. I'm sitting here with a plastic bottle of LaCroix.
Right.
I mean, if this was more expensive, or if it was in a bottle that was compostable or recyclable, and it was a little more expensive, I would buy that. I don't know that, knowing that I can't recycle this really is going to change my behavior. If there's no alternative, I'll just throw it in the trash instead of throwing it in the recycling to throw it in the trash. I mean, that's just human behavior, I think.
Right.
So I think that it sounds like these incentives to change the production cycle, the circular production or circular products. I mean, that seems great. That seems like the kind of thing that actually could make more change than just telling people, hey, you're wasting your time by throwing away that plastic bottle.
It seems to have a fair bit
Which
of
you probably
support,
are.
in Olympia. All right, we're taking a quick break now. We'll be right back with Week in Review right after this.
Support for KUOW comes from Eco Design and Maintenance, family-owned and specializing in start-to-finish exterior design using materials and methods that help to reduce environmental impact. From landscapes to hardscaping, outdoor spaces designed to be functional and long-lasting. More at eco-seattle.com.
Hey, it's KUOW politics reporter Scott Greenstone. President Trump's tariff policy has sent the global economy into chaos. Tariffs on most countries are paused for 90 days, but a trade war is now escalating with China. That can mean bad times are ahead for Washington businesses. We talked with Gary Locke, former governor, Secretary of Commerce, and ambassador to China, about what the future may hold. That's on Sound Politics. Listen on the KUOW app and wherever you get your podcasts.
Welcome back to Week in Review. We have with us PubliCola co-founder and publisher and one-third of the Seattle Nice podcast, Erica Barnett, Seattle Times editorial writer Josh Farley, political analyst and contributing columnist, and recurring cast member Joni Balter. Every budget story you hear about these days lacks one specific term: surplus. The city of Seattle is no different and facing a potential $241 million shortfall over the next 2 years. Erica, this one lands squarely in your lap. Can you both explain and then solve this problem for us?
Sure, no problem. So I can explain it anyway. The $241 million comes over 2 years, comes from a combination of taxes and fees and things that are showing up short. But the biggest of those is the Jumpstart payroll tax, which accounts for the majority of that shortfall. And it's not that the Jumpstart payroll tax, which is a tax on the payrolls of the largest corporations and their top paid employees, it's not that it's coming in, in a negative. It's just not growing as fast as the city expected. And so that's for a lot of different reasons. But the main ones seem to be that the stock market has tanked. And so the stocks that are part of people's compensation are not worth as much, so they are not taxed as much. It's not producing as much revenue. And the other is, and we don't have exact numbers on this, but it's jobs moving to Bellevue and other parts of King County. And the tax is only levied in Seattle, and it really relies heavily on 10 companies and really on Amazon. And unfortunately, the city doesn't show those exact revenues, so we don't know how much we're relying on Amazon, but it's a big part. So when
it doesn't
Amazon
delineate which companies pay how much.
Nope.
Okay.
And so that's all proprietary for reasons that are above my pay grade. But the result is, if Amazon moves a bunch of jobs to Bellevue, then we don't get that money. And so the City Budget Forecast Council believes that is happening as well.
That Amazon is moving jobs away and avoiding the payroll tax that happens here in
that's
Seattle.
why the payroll tax is a good and bad idea. So it totally generated money that the city needed. You have to note that, although not as much as we are heading into the fall and the budget times as was hoped. But part of the reason, and you said it very well, Erica, is because Amazon moved, I believe, 10,000 jobs to Bellevue from Seattle because they were not so happy with the Seattle City Council and the payroll tax.
Well, I don't think that, just to clarify what I said, I mean, I don't, that very well could be. The Forecast Council is not saying that. They're just observing that these jobs have moved. It could be for all kinds of reasons related to Seattle. I mean,
right, but Amazon wasn't quiet about why they were moving. They explained, we don't like the way this government is operating, and we're going to send a bunch of jobs to Bellevue. They told everybody that. I've talked to them a couple times about it. And so I do think that we have to be careful when we see these taxes that look like they'll save us. And it did for a couple of years. It's fair to say it did for a couple of years. And also, so easy fixes, careful about those. I did want to point out, Eric, I noticed in two of your stories the word grim in a headline and in a lead. And so I guess it is kind of grim.
So, yeah, to answer the second half of that question, I mean, I think that the city is, again, I'll say for the third time, I think, on the show that they need to be running around with their hair on fire, and they're not. And so I think the city, especially because it's an election year for Bruce Harrell and the council president, Sarah Nelson, I think they're not going to want a bunch of horrific economic news. If that's going to happen, they're going to push it off into the next budget. It's kind of what Harrell did in the last budget, actually, because there were already deficits projected going forward into 26, 27.
And the city is committed to spending a whole bunch of money that it doesn't have the money for right now.
Just committed last year to $100 million or so in new spending. And so I think what the city is going to do, I think the mayor is going to do the usual thing that mayors do and say, okay, every department come back to me, except police and fire, you're sacrosanct. We will never cut you. Come back to me with 8% budget cuts, which is not going to be enough. And they're not going to get made because they're politically challenging. And so they're going to take more money from Jumpstart, which is originally supposed to be dedicated to some specific spending categories. That went out the window last year.
So briefly, what spending categories was Jumpstart supposed to go to?
It was supposed to go to housing, Green New Deal, small business assistance, and one other category that I always forget. I think the city's going to be forgetting it as well. Well, they've already forgotten it.
Right.
They literally last year passed a new law saying that they don't have to pay any attention to the spending plan. That was the entire purpose of passing the tax in the first place. So now it's just a slush fund.
Yeah, I would just add from the state legislative, state legislature that I spend a lot more time thinking about that there is a cautionary tale here from Seattle's experience from what happened with Amazon, and we have seen our state lawmakers. Nothing is certain until they get through the budget process and the governor signs, of course, the budget. But nonetheless, I think that they're seeing that payroll tax isn't going to be the way they're to go.
Equitable development. That was the last category. It just came to me. Okay.
Right. So when
it's the plastic
when we're dealing with this, and just to wrap it up, then there is no clarity, and really no one really knows where these cuts are going to be coming from. Then, correct?
At this point, no. I mean, I think that everybody that I've talked to has said everything's on the table, which means nothing.
Two more forecasts to go and a lot of hope.
Yeah. All right. Switching the topic to something slightly different, the Seattle City Council approved legislation to regulate what it is called unregulated after-hours businesses. In the wake of late-night homicides and disturbances near such businesses during the past decade, the ordinance would require security cameras. We're talking primarily about businesses such as hookah lounges. The ordinance would require security cameras and 2 security people. The changes do not apply to bars, but these other, what they refer to as unregulated late-night businesses. Joni, was this legislation needed?
Yeah, absolutely. There have been a dozen people who have been killed in the last 10 or 12 years. It's not safe for anyone. I don't think it's a huge hardship to require security officers and a camera. They've made the case that they need a little attention and help. The neighbors, the police, victims, everybody's losing too much. This is not something you just look the other way at. You don't.
I mean, to be clear, I mean, these are hookah lounges that are primarily, it's immigrant businesses, and they do serve a cultural, need and purpose. I don't think it's fair or accurate to say they're not safe for anyone. And Marcus Green wrote a good piece in the Stranger about kind of the cultural space that these places occupy. However, it is not safe for anyone to be getting shot, and for
I will
shootings to
recognize
happen.
the sort of cultural importance while saying, why can't we do it, the same way we do other things, trying to apply a safety measure to it.
Well, I mean, and so I would say that this legislation, like a lot of the legislation the Seattle City Council has passed, is largely pretty performative. I mean, a hookah lounge was shut down recently on existing nuisance laws because it was declared a nuisance property.
That's where my next question was going, right?
They had a security guard, at least one security guard already on site, and he was one of the people that was shot. And so, that would not, having these measures in place would not have made any difference, except if they had only one security guard, perhaps it would have required another. I mean, most of the stuff that's in this bill is already illegal. You already can't serve alcohol after 2 a.m. in the state of Washington. You already have to allow police.
And many of the hookah lounges, as I understand it,
don't serve alcohol.
Don't serve alcohol. They don't have a liquor license.
That's kind of the
and
point.
Culturally also didn't anyway.
Right. They're a place to go after hours, where you don't drink. And so, so that's already illegal. A lot of them already have security and video cameras, which is another element of the requirements. And police, you have to let police inside a public venue. And so that is also in the bill. There's not, and people are getting shot outside. So in any case, none of these things, I mean, unless your goal is, as Ed Murray tried to do, to shut down every hookah lounge in the city, this is another performative, at least as I see it, it's a performative measure by the council.
All right, so let's go to a couple. We've just got a little bit of time left. Let's go to a couple quick headlines. In retaliation for steep U.S. tariffs, China has halted delivery of Boeing 737s. Yet more good news for Boeing and the 737. What's a reaction to that? Is this something that, I mean, the trade war is expanding. There's yet another victim in the trade war.
The trade war is supposed to be about making America first. But what are we doing? We're taking an American manufacturer, which is already having Boeing, its own self-generated problems, and we're adding to the pile of problems for that company when China retaliates and says, we'll hold off on deliveries.
All right. Both GeekWire and the Seattle Times, another headline, reported that someone hacked several crosswalk signals to change the voice from crossing instructions to a fake Jeff Bezos asking people to, quote, please don't tax the rich. This is, I don't know whether you could consider this a prank or vandalism. Perhaps you would consider it both. Joni, you referenced this being kind of creepy, but since we know how you feel about it, let's shift it slightly. What actually made you smile this week?
Oh, well, a couple of things. I'm going to get in trouble on one, but I'll do the first one first. It's sort of worry-free. I think it's really cool that PCC, which was downtown ever so briefly, is left because, sort of the public safety and the lack of Amazonians running around that particular area because they canceled that building. I think that it's kind of cool that PCC is now going to go do a small form. I don't know what this looks like, but a small form store downtown.
Great. Josh, quick smile.
So Molly Moon happened to be at Terminal 46 with Maria Cantwell on Wednesday. And I don't think we quite have a date yet when it will open, but I'm excited that a new Molly Moon's is opening. I know Portland-based Salt and Straw is also coming in on the ice cream front here in Seattle. But I do love me some Molly Moon's, and I'm excited about that.
Erica, quick smile.
This year I went to a bunch of places during Restaurant Week, which I don't usually do. That ended this week, and I think the standout was a place, a halal Malaysian place called Makasan. It operates out of a commissary kitchen in Soto, but it also has pop-ups, and I think the next one is happening at La Spiga on Capitol Hill on April 27th.
Ooh, sounds
so you can
good.
check that out.
All right, all of you, thank you so much for joining us on Week in Review. Political analyst and contributing columnist Joni Balter, PubliCola co-founder and publisher and one-third of the Seattle Nice podcast, Erica Barnett, and Seattle Times editorial writer Josh Farley. Thank all of you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Mike.
Great job,
Also,
Mike.
producer Kevin Knestad, Bernard Wallet on the board, social media by Juan Pablo Chiquiza, and additional support from Hans Twite. I'm Mike Lewis.
Support for KUOW comes from Third Place Books, journalist Malcolm Harris.